Hey listeners, welcome back to Infinite Podcast, where extraordinary tales never end. Today we're diving into a chapter from the 1930s where folks didn't just survive, they got creative. We've got tales of repurposing, community spirit, a time when sheer ingenuity became the currency of survival. Simon, ever heard of turning feed sacks into fashion? Those were some real resourceful times.
Oh, Joe, feed sack fashion? That's like turning lemons into lemonade stand franchises. People were so crafty it makes my DIY projects look like child's play. But hey, nothing beats the classic tin can turned into, well, literally anything back then.
For those just joining in, we're reminiscing about the 1930s, an era that redefined resourcefulness. Our ancestors rocked feed sack dresses and turned tin cans into treasures. If you think recycling is a new trend, folks back then were the original eco-warriors before it was cool.
Sure, they were eco-warriors, but not by choice, right? Imagine you're cooking dinner and your pot breaks. Nowadays, it's a quick trip to the store, but back then, it was patch it up with whatever you've got lying around and hope for the best. They were like the MacGyvers of the Great Depression, makes our reduce, reuse, recycle look like child's play.
Spot on, Simon. Necessity bred invention every day back in the 1930s. We replace, they repaired. Broke a pot? That's an invitation to innovate, not just a chore. Shaping scrap metal, wood, whatever found objects into something functional was their daily grind. They didn't MacGyver for fun. It was their way of life.
Absolutely, their daily grind was no joke. Check this out. Back in the day, during those grim 1930s, when the economy tanked big time, unemployment skyrocketed, right? We're talking about 1/4 of Americans without a job. People had to be slick with their skills just to make ends meet. Families would actually build Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, making entire shanty towns from scraps they could scrounge up. Men hopped on railroad cars searching for work miles away, living off handouts. Kids' toys? They came straight from the imagination, carved out of wood or stitched together from rags. It was the era where folks heard no, and they said, "Watch me." The resilience they showed wasn't just impressive, it was legendary.
Legendary? You could say that again. We think we know hustle, but those Hooverville constructors were the OGs of grit. Carpenters without certificates using scrap materials to craft communities from dust. Riding rails for work wasn't scenic, it was survival, pure and simple. The toys weren't store-bought but love-made. That watch me attitude? It built more than towns. It forged an iron-willed generation.
Legendary? Maybe, but let's not romanticize it too much. Sure, those folks had grit, you've got to give them that. But life in a Hooverville was no picnic. They weren't just popping up tents for fun, it was rough going. And the kids' toys? Love-made maybe, but I bet any kid back then would have traded that wooden truck for a Superman comic in a heartbeat. Their resilience was born out of desperation, not because they wanted to be record-breaking survivors or something. We look back and call it resourceful, but guess what? Given a choice, they'd have gone for the cushy 9 to 5 and a house with an actual foundation. Not so legendary when you're living it.
You've got a solid point, Simon. Behind the sepia-toned tales of resilience, there's real struggle. Heartache not captured in those famed photos. Kids making do with simple toys when dreaming of comic book heroes. Families cobbling together shelter in Hoovervilles. Tough doesn't begin to cover it. Those stories weren't just about ingenuity. They were cries of folks pushed to the limit, clawing for normalcy. They're reminders. Adversity breeds strength, sure, but let's not forget the hardship that forced it out of them.
Joe, that's deep. But don't you wonder what those families would think of us now? With all our tech and fancy gadgets, do you think they'd see us as soft? Or would they be impressed by how far we've come with the basics they had to fight with tooth and nail just to get by?
Imagine explaining to someone from the 1930s that we have robots that clean our floors and phones that connect us globally in seconds. Mind-blowing, right? They'd probably think we live like royalty. But would they see us as soft? Maybe in some ways. Let's be real. Many of us panic when Wi-Fi drops for a minute. On the flip side, though, I'd bet they'd dig our ingenuity, building on what they started, finding new peaks to climb.
Oh, panic at the disco when the Wi-Fi is down, huh? That's us all right. But can you blame us? We've become the ultimate convenience kings and queens. As for them thinking we're wizards with our gadgets, sure, but I'd bet my last dollar they'd also throw some shade our way. Like you built rockets to Mars, but you still can't make a donut that won't make you fat. Come on, Joe. Our ingenuity has its limits.
Haha, Simon. No fat-free donuts yet, but we've got self-driving cars on the horizon. Priorities, right? They'd be shaking their heads for sure.
Let me tell you about my great uncle Ned, a real character from that era. He had this rickety old pickup truck he called Bessie. Now, Bessie was way past her prime, but Uncle Ned needed her to get his veggies to market, couldn't afford a new one. So what does he do? He keeps Bessie running with bubble gum and baling wire, literally. One time, the exhaust pipe fell off mid-drive, so he ties it back on with wire from a fence. Talk about resourceful. And that truck kept going for years like that. Just goes to show, they could make miracles out of messes.
Uncle Ned and Bessie. Now, that's a survival story. Keeping trucks running with bubblegum takes more than just resourcefulness. It takes serious moxie. These are the stories you can't make up. What wild tricks do you think people today would pull off if we had to get as creative as Uncle Ned?
Man, speaking of Uncle Ned's times, that era wasn't just about flat tires and broken exhausts. It also had the Dust Bowl. That was a wild ride Mother Nature took them on. But here's the twist. Humans had a hand in it too. Over farming, no crop rotation, we kind of set the stage for disaster, and then nature dropped the curtain. Makes you wonder, are we any smarter with our planet today?
Absolutely, Simon. Nature punched hard with the Dust Bowl, but we definitely threw the first swing with poor farming practices. We turned prairies into dust, then the winds did the rest. A cautionary tale, right? Fingers crossed we're learning, because today it's about climate change, deforestation. We've got our own list of eco-missteps. And just like back then, there's a price to pay if we don't wise up and respect the balance. Are we smarter? Let's hope so. Actions always speak louder than words when it comes to caring for our planet.
Hope is great, but let's be real. Sometimes it seems like we're just not getting it. I mean, sure, we've got electric cars now, solar panels, all that jazz, but at the same time, we're still trotting after fossil fuels like they're going out of style, which, spoiler alert, they are. Plus, we've got this throwaway culture that would have made Dust Bowl farmers' heads spin. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without, remember? Maybe they should put that slogan on billboards instead of ads for the next iPhone, huh?
You're spot on, Simon. The Dust Bowl is a stark reminder that our actions can drastically amplify natural disasters. Bad farming practices turned an environmental challenge into a catastrophe. Today's challenges with climate change echo back to those lessons on the importance of working in harmony with nature rather than against it. Soil conservation and sustainable agriculture aren't just good practice, they're a necessity. We're dancing on the edge if we don't apply those hard-earned lessons from the past to our current predicaments.
You know, Joe, this takes me back to my grandpa's farm, where I spent summers as a kid. He was all about that harmony with nature deal. His farm was like a green oasis in a concrete jungle. He used to say, take care of the earth and it'll take care of you. One year we had this brutal drought. Neighbors were losing crops left and right, but not Grandpa. He'd built these rain barrels, had crop rotation down to an art, and he planted trees as windbreaks before it was cool. One day, I'm out there blaming the sun for being too hot, and he just laughs and says, boy, you can't control the weather, but you can be ready for it. That's what he taught me, preparedness and respect for the land. Seeing his foresight in action, man, that stuck with me more than any lesson from a textbook.
Your grandpa was a visionary, Simon. Just like during the Dust Bowl, when we learned the hard way about the need for proper land management, your grandpa understood and lived by those principles. It's all about being proactive, not reactive, like wearing sunscreen instead of treating the burn. Modern society still needs to embrace that old-school wisdom fully. Being ready for it is just as crucial now with climate change knocking on our door as it was for dealing with the sun scorching crops back then.
Right? My grandpa was like a one-man army against bad farming. He knew every inch of his land and what it needed. And that's the thing. We had the Dust Bowl as this huge red flag shouting, "Hey, don't mess up the soil." You'd think we'd all get on Grandpa's level after that. But here we are, decades later, and sometimes I wonder if we're just setting the stage for Dust Bowl 2.0 with the way we treat the environment. It takes guts to change course. It's just to really commit to doing better by our planet. The real question is, do we have the same resolve now as those who faced down the Dust Bowl did back then?
The resolve? Tough call. Back in the Dust Bowl days, they had no choice but to adapt or be buried alive by their own mistakes. Nowadays, it's like we see the storm coming and still argue over who should hold the umbrella. We've got all this dazzling tech and knowledge, Simon, but are severely lacking the unified will to pivot like they did. It's ironic. Our ancestors battled with nature out of necessity, while we choose our battles even when we see the consequences. If we could channel just a fraction of their grit into global cooperation, imagine the environmental crises we'd avoid. Maybe we need that same back-against-the-wall pressure to really kick us into high gear for Earth's sake.
You got me thinking about this camping trip I had a few years back, Joe. So there I was, deep in the woods, me and a couple of buddies, real into nature and all that jazz. We set up camp, do the whole leave no trace routine because, we're decent human beings. Now it's the middle of the night, right? Suddenly, we wake up to this wild storm, our tents almost flying away. You'd think we'd be pros, but nope. We were like kids scrambling in the dark. Eventually, we managed to secure our gear, literally tying our tent to trees, and waited out till dawn. In that blustery chaos, all I could think was, this is us, trying to keep our planet together with strings and sheer hope, not really prepared for the howling gale that's on us. And just like my buddies and I patching up our tent, it feels like we're always scrambling last minute to fix Earth's problems. That trip, let me tell you, was a humbling lesson in respect for what Mother Nature can dish out, and a reminder that we really should get our act together before the storm hits, not during.
That's exactly it, Simon. Nature respects strength and smarts. Your camping fiasco, it's like a mini version of our environmental attitude. We tend to react instead of getting ahead of the problems, hustling only when the winds are whipping at our backs. It's high time we camp like seasoned pros, respecting nature by being ready before the storm hits, not after. We've got the resources to do it. What we need is that collective push, a global leave no trace mentality.
I'm all about that leave no trace life, but come on, Joe, most folks aren't thinking past what's for dinner. It's like with Uncle Ned and Bessie. We do the bare minimum to keep going, hoping we won't run out of bubblegum before we hit the finish line. But this isn't a clunker truck. It's our planet. We've seen what happens when we push the environment too hard. The Dust Bowl showed us Mother Nature will clap back if you disrespect her. And now, we're playing tag with climate change, slapping on Band-Aids when we need surgery. The problem is huge, but so was the Dust Bowl, and yet they powered through because they had to. It's our turn at bat, Joe, and it's on us to swing for the fences, not just hope for a walk. Sure, planting a tree is good, but changing how societies function from the ground up, that's grand slam material right there.
Talk about surgery. We need to start with the backbone. Education. Let's swap out some calculus classes for sustainable living lessons. Imagine high schools where kids learn to power a city and grow vertical gardens between algebra equations. That'd turn some heads.
Education is key, but you know what else gets people moving? Good old protests. Back in the day, folks didn't just talk about it. They built entire towns like Hoovervilles to stick it to the man. Nowadays, we've swapped shanty towns for hashtags. Both got attention, but while one makes you trip over tents, the other floods your feed with memes and viral rants. It's wild how shouting for change went from packing a city square to trending on Twitter.
You know, Simon, this whole shift from physical to digital protests reminds me of my Aunt Lucy's birthday. Bear with me. So Aunt Lucy's just turned 80, right? Big milestone. We planned this huge surprise party, balloons, cake, the works, as you'd do for such an occasion. Halfway through planning, my cousin has a brainwave. Let's make it virtual, get the relatives overseas involved. Great idea. Modern times call for modern solutions after all. Fast forward, We're all on this video call, singing happy birthday across different time zones, like a disjointed choir when someone comments, "This isn't quite what we pictured." That's the crux. Nothing replaces being there in person, feeling the energy, seeing the impact. But man, did that virtual gathering stretch miles and connect hearts just as strongly, if not more, because everyone could join. That's the power of digital today. It crosses borders instantly, spreading messages far and wide, even if it can't always replicate the rally's impassioned cries or the solidarity you feel when you lock arms with strangers fighting for a cause.
Hoovervilles, huh? Those were like the original pop-up protests. Imagine setting up a tent city because you're that fed up. It's like saying, hey, we're here, we're poor, get used to it. Now we've got hashtags, less about the cardboard signs and more about those 140 characters to slap you with some truth. The thing is, Joe, in some bizarre way, I kind of respect the Hooverville hustle. They literally built their anger into a physical presence. Hard to ignore that. But then again, building shantytowns wasn't exactly a five-star approach to activism, was it? Fast forward to now, hashtags are like digital smoke signals calling the tribe together, but from the comfort of your couch. Less risk of rain, sure, but also less of the hands-dirty solidarity. I mean, really, what would happen if we brought back Hoovervilles with Wi-Fi? Let's see which hashtag can build a house faster, yeah?
Oh, for sure. Picture this. Hooverville 2.0, sustainable tiny homes popping up outside tech HQs with live tweets plastered on the sides. It's a protest, it's a community project, it's the most Instagrammable activism ever.
That's a picture for the ages, but can you imagine the confusion? Social media is king, Joe, because it's quick and dirty. People scrolling through their feeds get snapshots of issues, sure, but they're also one swipe away from cat memes and vacation pics. The struggle is keeping them engaged. Now, with Hoovervilles, when you built one, it stayed. No swiping it off your screen. Those tent cities had staying power, literal landmarks of dissent. They weren't just noticed, they were an in-your-face daily reminder to every passerby. Plus, there's something to be said about showing up physically. It demonstrates commitment. Protesters enduring the elements sends a much stronger message than a retweet ever could. Online movements may reach more eyes, but do they have the same heart? Maybe not.
For those just jumping in, we've been chuckling over how protests have gone from pitching tents to trending topics. Old school Hoovervilles were the 1930 of tangible tantrums against the times, whereas today it's all about firing up hashtags for virtual vigilantes. Back then, your beef with the system got you mud on your boots. Nowadays, a retweet or revolution might spread the word, but could leave that same boot spotless. Stick around as Simon and I keep digging through the dirt of dissent, old digs versus digital digs.
Absolutely, Joe. Hoovervilles were all about that visual punch. You couldn't ignore a shantytown in your backyard. Those protesters got their hands dirty, literally building their anger and hardship into something you could see and touch. Fast forward to today, and we've traded those plywood protests for pixelated ones. Sure, hashtags can go viral worldwide in seconds, which is powerful, no doubt. But do they create the same impact? Does a retweet weigh as much as a night out in the cold, making a statement with your presence? I think there's something deep about getting down in the mud for what you believe in. Digital dissent is clean, but maybe too easy. Meanwhile, old-school protest requires skin in the game, a physical dedication. Hard to say which is better, right? One thing's for sure, hashtags won't give you splinters.
Oh, the splinters. They're character building. But let's flip the script for a sec. Hashtags actually democratize protests. Back with Hoovervilles, you had to be there in person, which meant if you were sick, busy, or miles away, tough luck. Your voice didn't count. Fast forward, enter the mighty hashtag. Now anyone with a phone can join the fight, no tent pitching required. The physical barriers are gone, and suddenly the whole world's your stage. Digital activism isn't necessarily shallow, it's just different, with depth and reach rather than endurance. And that accessibility, it's invaluable for global movements. Can't dismiss that power.
Swapping plywood for pixels, huh? What a time to be alive. I mean, hashtags are this generation's picket signs. Except now, instead of standing out in the cold, getting ignored by people walking past, you get ignored online by millions at once. It's like we've upgraded from shouting in the streets to shouting into the digital void, hoping someone hits like or retweet before scrolling to that vid of a skateboarding dog. But here's a kicker, Joe. Imagine old-timey protesters with social media. Just finished my shift at the Hooverville. LOL. Shanty chick, hashtag Great Depression. How about we go full meta, a throwback protest complete with Instagrammable soup lines and live tweeted bread lines. Do it for the gram, am I right?
Hoovervilles and hashtags, man. When you think about it, both aimed for visibility, but in wildly different arenas. The Hooverville crowd had physicality, building a village of vex out of desperation. These days, you fire off a hashtag and boom, instant visibility, at least until the next scroll. Protest's evolution is just staggering. It's less about occupying space and more about occupying headspace now. Different methods, same goal, to get heard. And in this age of digital noise, sometimes I wonder if we need a bit of that old school grit to cut through the meme clutter.
You're spot on, Joe. Whether you're staking out space with a Hooverville or trending with a hashtag, it all comes down to being seen and heard. But here's a thought. What if we need a bit of both? What if the key to real change is combining that old-school physical commitment with the digital world's reach? Maybe using our screens to organize, but our streets to demonstrate. Could that be the recipe for cutting through the clutter? The sheer willpower of the past, plus today's tech. Now there's something to tweet about.
Absolutely. Merging the passion of the past with today's tech could definitely shake things up. Speaking of shaking things up, let's take a not-so-smooth segue into something related to big moves from the past, the New Deal. It was full of attempts to revitalize the economy, but man, it had some wild side effects and oddball projects that even Hoovervilles couldn't hold a candle to.
Oh, the New Deal. There's a treasure trove of weird tales. Reminds me of this story my grandpa told me about his first job. You'll love this, Joe. He was hired to paint murals on public buildings. Get this, that nobody ever visited. Like, who's going to the local post office to admire fine art? But hey, it gave him work during tough times. Grandpa would laugh, saying he felt like Michelangelo working on the Sistine Chapel, only his chapel was a tiny room where people sort mail and cough suspiciously too much. He wasn't just getting paid, he was culturally enriching an audience of postal workers. Only under something as wild as the New Deal would you get a gig painting frescoes where most action is stamp licking. What a time!
Ha! Your grandpa, the Michelangelo of mailrooms, classic New Deal. It's funny because it throws logic out the window but puts money in your pocket. Just imagine today's world trying to pull that off. Like, hey man, we're going to pay you to draw aliens on the side of a UFO watchtower. It's bizarre, sure, but sometimes odd jobs stir up the pot in the best way. Not just the economy getting a boost, but creativity too. Wild stuff.
No way, really? So they actually paid people to scribble art where most folks wouldn't even glance twice unless they were mailing a postcard. It's kind of genius in its own wacky way. There's your tax dollars at work, fueling the fine arts in government buildings. Makes you wonder what other sorts of crazy gigs got cooked up back then just to keep the cash flowing and brushes stroking. If that was now, we'd be paying folks to Photoshop capes on pigeons for an Urban Avian Heroes campaign or something. The New Deal made sure boots and paintbrushes stayed on the ground.
Oh, you bet. It was basically a government-sponsored art fest in the most unexpected places. Think about it. I got a gig painting zebras on the crosswalks, zebra crossings taken literally. But nothing tops the actual New Deal project of teaching people how to be circus performers because, that's what the breadline was missing. More clowns.
Circus skills? Now that's top-tier job creation, New Deal style. A little juggling here, a bit of tightrope walking there, and boom, you're circus ready. I mean, Joe, think about the interview process for that. I see here on your resume you've got 5 years of experience in lion taming. It's wild. But hey, let's get real. These days, do we need more clowns? We've got enough of those running around already, especially online. Imagine the tweets if programs like that kicked off today. Tash New Deal nonsense. Today I mastered elephant balancing. Take that, unemployment. You gotta hand it to them though. They sure knew how to keep spirits up. Unemployment goes down, circus attendance goes up. What a spectacle.
Digging into the New Deal's grab bag, there's plenty more where that came from. Did you know they paid folks to surveil squirrels? That's right. In Washington, D.C., during the peak of nut gathering season, they had people safeguarding the public's nuts from thieving squirrels. It was part of a broader aim to protect and manage wildlife, but on paper, it sure reads like a nutty job. Then there were projects like employing writers to pen down local histories and folklore, culminating in the American Guide series, a collection of guidebooks for each state, which is both a cultural gem and kind of quaint when you think about it. People were literally paid to drive around and scribble notes about local haunts. The New Deal wasn't just an economic lifesaver, it was a peculiar patchwork quilt of human endeavor.
Squirrel surveillance? Now that's a gig that drive me nuts. But you've got to admit, Joe, those gigs, whether watching squirrels or writing state secrets, they added flavor to history. It wasn't just about pulling the economy out of the dumps, it was giving people stories to tell. Just picturing some guy stalking squirrels in the park with binoculars makes you think, what other kooky jobs did the New Deal cook up? There's got to be more where that came from. So, what's the next gem from this patchwork quilt you've got for us, Joe?
Absolutely, the whole notion of the New Deal was about making the most out of what you had, repurposing and reinventing. Interestingly enough, that's not too far off from what we see today with thrift shopping culture, right? It's like modern-day squirrels gathering nuts, but we're collecting vintage clothes and retro goods. There's a philosophy to it. People are rejecting fast fashion in favor of older, reusable items, all while saving a buck or two. So it seems the spirit of ingenuity from the Great Depression lives on in our shopping habits, making old new again. It's quite the cycle, isn't it? Let's dive into this thrift trendy world and see where philosophical meets economical in the ragged riches of thrift stores.
Yeah, Joe, thrift shopping's like the hipster's gold rush. People today are all about digging through racks for that unique find. It's like rescue missions for abandoned treasures. Ethics play a big role too. It's not just about scoring a deal on a funky 80s windbreaker or finding grandma's old lamp that inexplicably looks cool now. Shoppers are thinking about their carbon footprint, the whole reduce, reuse, recycle jazz. Plus, there's something satisfying about giving a second life to something that was once loved. Or let's be real, something that was hideously out of fashion and is somehow in again, because fashion is weird. It's thrift or be thrifted out there.
I hear you on the eco and retro appeal, but let's not put a halo on thrift shopping just yet. There's this glamorization of thrifting, right? Yet the flip side is it can turn into a hipster treasure hunt, gentrifying what used to be a necessity for lower-income folks. Suddenly, prices in thrift stores shoot up because picking through Granny's cast-offs is in. So while some are patting themselves on the back for being green, they're also making it harder for those who rely on thrifting as an affordable necessity, not just a Saturday afternoon vintage safari. It's a complex weave, this thrift culture. Not all threads are equal.
Oh man, thrift shopping. It's like everyone's down for a wardrobe treasure hunt nowadays. But I gotta be honest, Joe, it's weird when you see folks who normally drop cash at high-end stores suddenly competing with me for $3 shirts. There's this whole save the planet vibe, which is cool, but let's not forget the bargain hunters who've been doing this since before it was trendy. It's like the people who really need those deals are now fighting with fashionistas and eBay resellers over pre-loved flannel. Sometimes I wonder if my old band t-shirt is going to end up costing someone a week's worth of groceries because it's got that vintage street cred. Ethics in thrifting, it's kind of turned into, may the best hipster win.
You've got a point there. I'm curious, do you think there's a way to balance the scales so that thrift shopping stays true to its roots, affordable and accessible, while also catering to this new wave of eco-conscious fashion hunters? Or is it inevitable that the two worlds collide with winners and losers on both sides?
Joe, this reminds me of the time I snagged an ancient leather jacket from a thrift shop. It had that worn-in charm, you know? Now, I didn't buy it to save the planet or anything. I just wanted to look like a budget James Dean. Walking down the street feeling cool, I bumped into a dude in a pricey biker jacket, probably cost more than my rent. We both nodded, like some secret jacket gang. Later that week, I see him at the same thrift store. Turns out he loved the vibe of my vintage find. Next thing you know, the place is swarmed with folks searching for old school cool. Prices climbed as the thrift rush caught on. It struck me then, thrift stores have morphed. They're not just necessity markets anymore. They've become treasure troves for all sorts. Balancing that eco-conscious cachet with keeping things affordable is tricky when everyone's hunting for their version of that same cool leather jacket.
And that's just it, isn't it? Thrift stores were never meant to be boutiques. This rags to riches story has a plot twist. Now the riches bit is overshadowing the rags. There's something off about someone Instagramming their thrift haul while not needing the discounts. It just doesn't sit right. The whole thing shifts when thrifting becomes a sport for the well-off. It's like a game of who can score the best retro find to show off. We forget there's a kid or a struggling artist on the other end who won't get that cool jacket because they got outbid by someone chasing street cred without stressing their wallet. I'll say it. There should be some respect for the roots of thrift culture. It's not always about who will look the most authentically vintage at brunch next Sunday.
I totally feel that, Joe. It's like thrift stores have become this catwalk where people flaunt their bargains, right? You see these haul videos, and it's clear some folks treat it as a fashion statement rather than, say, a necessity or even just appreciating the character of old stuff. I mean, if you need to dress for less, it's gotta sting watching someone turn your go-to spot into some trendy playground. We're all for greener choices and cool finds, but the spirit of thrift, that's about helping each other out, making do with what we've got. It shouldn't just be another runway where people compete for the spotlight. There's got to be a middle ground, something genuine, where a jacket is just a jacket, not a status update.
Just imagine a world where we didn't know the price or brand of what everyone was wearing. A thrift utopia where you choose a jacket just because it fits well, not for the likes it'll rack up. That would flip the script.
Absolutely. So, if we stripped away the brands and price tags from our gear, do you think people would still rush thrifting for style points? Or would they intentionally pivot back to the heart of thrift, finding something that genuinely suits them?
I'm skeptical. Take away the labels, and you've still got people craving that find. It's human nature to want what stands out or holds value, whether that's brand names or unique pieces from the past. The heart of thrift might be warm and fuzzy, but let's not kid ourselves. Style points matter to a lot of folks. It's like a game. Can you score that one-of-a-kind piece before someone else does? And if suddenly nobody could tell if your jacket was a dime a dozen or a rare find, I bet the allure would fade for many. This isn't just thrifting, it's fashion hunting in disguise.
Yeah, Joe, it's a real double-edged sword. In this treasure hunt called fashion, the thrill of finding that diamond in the rough can overshadow the true spirit of thrift. But hey, maybe that's just one thread in the tapestry of modern shopping. It leaves you asking where we'll stitch our values in next. What's going to light up the thrift scene tomorrow? Only time will tell. So what's on your mind now?
Speaking of lighting up the thrift scene, did you hear about that guy who bought an old painting for a few bucks at a garage sale, only to discover it was a lost masterpiece worth thousands? It's crazy how thrift finds can turn into incredible windfalls. Give a person the right moment and a keen eye, and boom, pennies become pounds. It shows just how much potential is hidden in those heaps of secondhand stuff. Let's chat about some of these wild rags to riches stories from the thrift world.
Oh, I've heard tons of those tales, Joe. Like there's this one about a lady who picked up a necklace for peanuts, right? Turns out it's an antique worth a small fortune. Makes you think, what if that ugly duckling of a vase collecting dust in my living room is actually a swan? It's not just clothes, it's everything in these places. Every thrift store is like Aladdin's cave, filled with potential treasures. Just gotta rub the right lamp, I guess.
Right? So how do you think these success stories influence the average shopper's mindset when they step into a thrift store? Do people start seeing every item as a potential gold mine?
Definitely, Joe. Now, every cracked teacup is a potential gold mine, thanks to these stories. You've got folks eyeballing every item like it's a winning lottery ticket. And you know what? Most times, they're just clutching at straws. The whole thrift shop flips into this weird museum where everything could be priceless. But let's be real. For every jackpot painting, there are 1,000 actual garage sale rejects. Not everyone has that Midas touch. Your coffee mug isn't secretly a relic, pal. Yet the hunt goes on. It's thrift shop fever.
Absolutely. The thrill of the hunt is real. There's something so human about that hope, isn't it? It can be heartbreaking to think your latest find could be the one, only to learn it's worth less than you paid. But don't you love that people still get caught up in the excitement and possibility? Every thrift store visit becomes this adventure where optimism rules the aisles. Sure, most walks through those doors won't lead to riches, but oh, the stories if they do.
Hey, new listeners, welcome to the Thrift Saga, where everyday folks turn their quarters into Queen's ransoms. We've been gabbing about those bonkers stories where Joe Average nabs a painting or a necklace from a yard sale, only to find out it's worth a mint. It's like we're all Indiana Jones in the aisles of secondhand stores, looking for our own lost artifact that could be our ticket to the big leagues, all about the thrill and dreams of striking gold amidst the forgotten and the faded. Stick around as we keep diving into the treasure chests of thrift shops.
Thrifting has always been about the thrill of the hunt, but now there's a whole subculture around snagging that hidden gem. And it's not just casual shoppers. Serious collectors and antique dealers are in on it too, all thanks to these rags to riches stories popping up. Did you know the average Goodwill store might see millions of items a year? The odds of finding something rare are slim, but with over 25,000 thrift stores in the US alone, those slim chances add up. Every so often, someone hits the jackpot with a rare comic book, a vintage watch, or even historical memorabilia. Take, for instance, the story of a West Point jacket from the thrift store which belonged to a famous general. It sold for a small fortune at auction. Or the copy of the Declaration of Independence found behind a painting, bought for pennies and sold for over $1 million. These finds might be one in a million, but they power the dreams that keep the thrift world spinning. It's about more than saving money now. It's the possibility that you might walk in looking for bargains and walk out with a piece of history in your hands.
Joe, the jackpot stories are wild, but they're essentially unicorns. It's so easy to get dazzled by these epic finds and forget that thrifting is mostly about day-to-day treasures. Sure, one person hits the headline with a rare find, but for each of those, there's thousands more sifting through grandma's old Tupperware. Let's face it, everyone dreams of finding that Declaration of Independence behind a $5 painting, but does it really power the thrift world? I'd argue people love the hunt, period. The chance of scoring big is just the cherry on top of digging up something weird or wonderfully vintage that makes your neighbor ask, "You got that from where now?" It's not all about the Benjamin Franklins, or in our thrift fantasia, the potential Benjamins. Sometimes it's about the story, the history, and let's be honest, bragging rights. Forget the money. It's the glory of that eureka moment in the checkout line that keeps us coming back. Rags to riches stories fuel the fantasy, but most of us are here for the ride, not the riches. So don't go quit your day job yet, my friends.
Hunting for treasure in thrift stores is like fishing. You might catch a big one, but the tall tales and the one that got away are half the fun. And honestly, finding a rare gem among the rubble, that's a modern-day urban legend in action.
Ha, right you are. The real treasures are the fish stories we swap after a day out in the thrift sea. Makes you wonder what legendary catches are lurking in that next pile of clutter. Just waiting for the right thrift pirate to come along. Our matey.
Oh, speaking of thrift pirates, here's a tale for you. A couple years back, I wandered into this old thrift shop on a lazy Sunday. The place was crammed, books spilling off shelves, records littering the floor. Now, I'm no record collector, just love me some classic rock. So, this dusty old vinyl catches my eye. A bit scuffed, cover worn down like it's seen better days. Turns out, It's an original pressing from a legendary band that had faded into obscurity. Casually, without much thought, I grabbed it for the price of a cup of coffee. Figured it would get some playtime at home. But then I did a little digging and, would you believe it, collectors were after this one. I'd stumbled on a bona fide hidden gem, worth a stack more than what I paid. I sold it to a collector who was over the moon about the find. Here's the kicker. I made enough to buy myself a sweet little guitar that I'd been eyeing for months. Talk about turning tunes into treasure. Goes to show, sometimes the real riches in thrift stores are the stories you live to tell.
Man, if that doesn't fuel the treasure hunting fire, I don't know what does. Picking up a forgotten gem and it turning into your new guitar, that's living the dream. It's these exact stories that make you want to roll up your sleeves and dive headfirst into a mountain of musty records. Who knows what jackpot might be snoring under that pile of 80s pop albums? Rock on, thrift store warriors. Rock on.
All right, but let's play devil's advocate for a sec. Not to rain on our thrift parade, but these jackpot tales, don't they warp what thrifting is really about? We're talking sustainability, giving items a second life, not mining for gold. It's cool to score a rare find, but I wonder if it overshadows the spirit of reuse and recycle. It seems like looking for quick cash might just undercut the ethical backbone of thrifting. Why are we there? For the environment and community, or just the what-if chance of a payday? Thrift stores were originally about charity and affordability. Now we've got this Indiana Jones fantasy turning your local Goodwill into a Vegas slot machine. So, should thrift stores remind us more about their core mission and less about striking it rich? There's charm in finding a $3 shirt you'll wear for years, even if it isn't designer or an antique. Isn't that worth celebrating too?
Oh, absolutely, Joe. There's definitely a flip side to that glittery thrift shop coin. It's classic human nature, though, isn't it? We hear one tale about easy riches and suddenly we're all prospectors in the gold rush of garage sales. But hey, is this get-rich thrifting mentality actually crowding out the little guy just looking for a bargain on some new-to-you jeans? Let's hash that out.
That reminds me of when I spotted this beaten-up old chess set at a yard sale. I'm not talking finely carved ivory or anything, just an ordinary plastic set, but it was the kind my granddad and I used to play with. Nostalgia hit me harder than a brick, so I bought it for a few bucks. Here's where it gets good. I'm playing with my nephew, teaching him the ropes, and he's all eyes and curiosity. He ends up beating me, fair and square. That sparked his love for chess, and now, the kid's a dynamo. Even won a school tournament. So yeah, the chess set didn't rake in wads of cash, but it started something more valuable, my nephew's passion. Funny how sometimes what we find isn't about the money. It's about the memories we make or the new stories we kick off. We go looking for one thing, maybe dreaming of finding a treasure, but we come back with something that money can't buy.
Isn't that just it, Joe? We set out for treasure, but sometimes the real gold is in those unexpected moments, like firing up a love for chess in your nephew. It's wild how a simple object can become so priceless, and not in the dollar sign sense. It makes me wonder what other stories are being written out there because of these modest thrift finds. There's treasure, all right, but maybe we've been measuring its worth all wrong. What's your take on that, listeners?
Transitioning from the idea of true value, not just monetary but emotional too, leads me to think about those hilarious mix-ups we hear about in thrift finds. It's like everyone's an amateur appraiser these days, sometimes with comically wrong valuations. Like this one time, a buddy of mine bought what he thought was this rare vintage board game. Turns out it was just a common, incomplete set, missing half the pieces. Talk about a plot twist. He went from thinking he could retire early to playing a defective game of Monopoly with makeshift paper money. So listeners, ever convinced you found kitsch that turned out to be cash or vice versa? Come on, share your tales of misappraisal, and let's get some laughs.
That's hilarious. So, Joe, what about the time you thought you scored big? You've got to have a story where you felt like the champ of Thrift Town, only to find out you were king of Comedy Castle instead. Spill it.
Ah, Simon, you're putting me on the spot. All right, I've got one that still cracks me up. So there was this old-looking painting I spotted shoved behind a stack of frames at this hole-in-the-wall thrift store. The thing looked ancient, had that could-be-worth millions vibe. Scooped it up, feeling like Indiana Joe, only to discover after a pricey appraisal, it's a high school art project from the 90s. And get this, the artist's signature was just a scribbled sticker on the back from some kid named Josh. Gotta hand it to Josh, though. He had me fooled and hopeful for a second there. Ever have a moment like that, Simon? Or how about our audience? Anyone else been both the hero and the punchline in their own treasure hunting tale?
Ha! Indiana Joe and the quest for Josh's masterpiece. I love it. So one time I scooped up this goofy-looking animal statue, convinced it was some exotic collectible. It had this mystic vibe, like a relic straight out of a temple in a jungle flick. Well, my rare artifact turned out to be a common garden gnome from the 80s, a local hardware store special. I went from dreams of an auction showdown to realizing I'd just bartered for someone's old lawn buddy. Picture me with a priceless holy grail of gnomes on my shelf. Come on, listeners, don't leave me and Joe hanging. What's your best kitsch or cash fiasco? Give us your blooper gold. We're all ears.
Hey, that's how it goes in the thrill of the hunt, man. 1 second you're holding on to what could be an ancient relic. Next thing you know, it's just Gary's gnome from 2 blocks over. No mystical powers unless you count scaring away the neighborhood cats. Send in your stories, folks. You localips.
But you know, Joe, there's something to be said for those misfires, too. They keep us grounded. In a world full of hype about finding the next big score, these bloopers remind us it's not always a fairy tale finish. And let's face it, they're a reality check against that whole get-rich-quick mentality. Each flub is like life's way of saying, take it easy, Indiana Joe. Slow down. Cherish the hunt more than the haul. It's about laughing at the journey and enjoying the stories we rack up along the way. Keeps the ego in check, right?
Oh, for sure, Simon. While it's great to laugh at our own blunders, this treasure or trash game also highlights the weird price we put on stuff. I mean, we're quick to label things as priceless just because they're old or odd. But sometimes we miss seeing the beauty in the ordinary. Take that Josh masterpiece. Sure, it wasn't an ancient relic worth big bucks, but it was someone's creativity. That gnome? Kitsch to some, yes, but maybe somebody's childhood memory turned garden protector. So let me toss this out there. Shouldn't we be valuing these thrift finds for their stories, their uniqueness, rather than potential dollar signs? Isn't finding joy in the kitsch itself sort of priceless? What do you guys think? Ever kept something just because it was, well, wonderfully weird or just made you smile?
Absolutely, Joe. You've hit the nail on the head. I reckon every worthless item we come across tells a tale or sparks a grin that's worth more than any price tag. Like this wonky teapot I found. Leaks more than a sieve, but has a cartoon duck looking like it's seen some things. I kept it because it's hilarious. We should start a segment. Kitsch Keepers. Share those bizarre or laugh-worthy treasures you'd never sell, even if someone offered you cash on the spot. What do you say, listeners? Got any kitsch keepers in your closets?
Simon, I love that. Kitsch keepers. It's not about the value, it's the laugh, the quirk, the downright strangeness that makes you keep it. And yeah, I think everyone's got that one oddball item they just can't part with. Let's hear those kitsch keeper stories. What treasure have you held on to for its sheer quirk factor? We're eager to hear your tales of irrational attachment to inanimate oddballs. Share away, and let's find beauty in the wacky and the weird.
Speaking of kitschy keepsakes, it's funny how thrifting trends can turn on a dime. 1 minute, you've got oodles of odd treasures just hanging around, waiting for a good home. The next minute, everyone's digging through bins like there's no tomorrow. But here's a curveball, Joe. With this surge of people flocking to secondhand shops, do we need to worry about thrifting sustainably? If more and more folks jump on the treasure hunting bandwagon, could we end up with thrift stores picked clean, leaving nothing but memories of what once was? Could mass thrifting chuck a wrench in the whole sustainability machine? What's the responsible way to keep our beloved hunt alive for future generations?
That's a solid point, Simon. Thrifting has exploded in popularity, especially with the younger generations. Thanks partially to social media and a growing environmental consciousness, we're seeing people from all walks of life hitting up thrift stores, looking for that pre-loved charm or sustainable fashion staple. This uptick in demand can lead to interesting challenges. The classic supply and demand crunch. Thrift shops rely on donations, and if everyone's buying but not as many are giving back, we could hit a snag. It's like a feedback loop. Prices might rise if goods become scarce, which then affects who can afford to shop secondhand. Plus, let's consider the carbon footprint associated with thrifting. While buying used items generally reduces waste and manufacturing demand, it also involves transporting goods, sometimes internationally, which adds to overall emissions. So the essence here is balance, ensuring we continue donating quality items, keeping our hunt local when we can, and not just buying for the sake of buying. Let's keep thrifting great for everyone, including the planet. Thoughts, listeners? How do you approach your treasure hunts with tomorrow in mind?
Absolutely. The thrifting game's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Great until everyone's stuffed and there's nothing left but crumbs. We don't want future thrifters just finding empty plates and tales of the good old days. Keeping it a treasure hunt means thinking about more than what's in our bag today.
So if thrifting's a buffet, we're talking sustainability. Let's not pile the plate so high that the next person in line gets slim pickings. But what if the problem isn't just running out of treasures? What if it's also about who gets to eat? Consider this. As more folks hunt bargains and unique finds for reselling at a profit, are we edging out those who depend on thrift stores' low prices for their basic needs? It could create exclusivity in a space that was fundamentally inclusive. It challenges us to rethink our roles within the thrifting culture. Are we contributors nurturing the cycle, or are we inadvertently taking more than our share? Let's get real and ask ourselves, how can we ensure there's enough to go around? And how do we not spoil the thrifting ground for others while we satisfy our own treasure hunting appetite? A tricky balancing act, but I'm curious to know, how does everyone else keep their thrifting habits ethical and sustainable?
It's a treasure hunter's paradox. The rush of snagging that perfect find versus wanting to leave enough gold in them hills for everyone else. Balance is key, but let me toss this into the mix. What about thrift flips? They could be our ace in the hole, turning something destined for the dump into a new kind of treasure. Keep stuff circulating and creativity high. What's the verdict? Thrifty alchemy or just another way to cash in on the craze?
It's like this whole DIY culture. People are taking these worn-down pieces from thrift shops and flipping them into something completely different. It's almost like repurposing on steroids. You take an old beat-up table, sand it down, hit it with some varnish, and boom, you've got yourself a piece that looks brand new. It's tapping into that creative spirit and pushing the boundaries of recycling, which I'm all for. But here's the catch. It can't just become another gold rush. If we're not careful, we risk turning thrifting into a gentrified playground. So let's approach it with that judicious mindset. Be the alchemist, not the opportunist. Keep it eco-solid and put in the time to create something genuinely valuable. It's a win-win when done right.
Definitely, Joe. So diving deeper into that, do you think there's a point where flipping veers away from being eco-friendly and sustainable and starts to just feed into the same old consumerist frenzy? Where do we draw the line between crafting and consuming?
Oh, for sure. There's a fine line there, and it gets blurry fast. When we start flipping items relentlessly just to turn a profit, well, that's when our once noble quest turns into the same beast we were trying to cage, unnecessary consumption. Here's how I see it. Crafting should mean adding value, not just slapping on a fresh coat of paint to make a buck. Otherwise, are we really any different from mass producers churning out new products left and right? The goal with flips should be to extend an item's life, not create demand for stuff nobody needed in the first place. It's all about intention. Are you flipping to genuinely save something from the landfill, or just contributing to the buy and discard cycle under a different guise? Touchy territory, but that's where the conversation's essential. Let's not forget why many people started thrifting: sustainability, community, and frankly, survival.
You've hit the nail on the head, Joe. Intention is everything. Like artists turning scrap metal into sculptures, it's about vision, not just flipping for a quick cash grab. If our flips are thoughtful, giving new life to what might otherwise be trash, then we're part of the solution. But here's my take. Ensure it stays accessible. Thrifting isn't just our playground, it's a lifeline for many. Let's keep it real and make sure those who truly need these resources don't get sidelined in our quest for quirky upcycling projects.
Absolutely, Simon. When scavenging for those hidden gems becomes mainstream, we've got to consider the impact on thrift stores and the communities they serve. If everyone's looking for treasure, prices can inflate, making it harder for those in need. Preserving treasure hunts for all means we've got to thrift consciously. It's not just about what you find, it's how you search. We should leave behind as much as we take, if not more, keeping the ecosystem balanced. Plus, if all of us start flipping responsibly, adding true value without taking essentials away from those who rely on these shops for much more than a trendy find, that's the sustainable path forward. So, future treasure hunters, remember, hunt with heart, be kind to your thrift store, and treat it like a communal garden. Tend to it, and it'll provide for everyone.
Totally, Joe. It's like we're all in this global neighborhood sharing one massive thrift store garden. When you put it that way, it's pretty deep. We don't want anyone to miss out because we were too busy chasing a profit or the next viral before and after pic. Gotta keep our hearts in the game and remember why these places exist. They're community cornerstones, not just treasure troves. Can't have them turning into exclusive clubs with a cover charge. Let's lead with empathy in our thrifting adventures, folks. Keep it wholesome, keep it fair, protect the garden for everyone.
Right on, Simon. At the end of the day, thrifting is part of a bigger picture. It's about community, sustainability, and responsible consumption. Let's not lose sight of that. Keep the conversation going, everyone. We have to ask ourselves, what impact are we leaving behind in our hunt for secondhand gold? And what will thrifting look like for generations to come if we're not careful? The future of this global neighborhood thrift store garden hinges on choices we make today. So, how do you keep your treasure hunting ethical? Let's chat.
You know, all this talk about thrifting and flipping gets me thinking. It's not just backyard heroes doing this. High fashion's in on it too. Some designers are taking trash and spinning it into couture treasures. We're talking big names making old look gold. They're pulling style out of the bin, literally. Taking grandma's old drapes, tossing aside the mothballs, and shazam, you've got a runway piece. It's wild how they're knitting together old-school craft with cutting-edge fashion, crossing threads from history right into today's eco-chic vibes. It's a game changer, huh? Turning everyday items into something strut-worthy while keeping an eye on Mother Nature. That blend of raw creativity and sustainability, it's what makes the whole fashion cycle feel fresh again. What'd you think, Joe? Could your patched-up jeans be the next big hit on the catwalks?
Ha, Simon, let's get real. My patched-up jeans are probably too avant-garde for the runways. But seriously, when you've got high-fashion gurus rifling through the rag pile for inspiration, that's when you know upcycling's hit the big leagues. These designers, man, they're like the mad scientists of style, turning what we'd call waste into high-end threads. It flips the script on fashion waste and gets us rethinking value. Your trash really is someone else's treasure. If these folks can turn discarded curtains into a gown that turns heads at a gala, it's telling us something powerful about where we could take this whole sustainability thing. It's not just environmentally sound, it's cutting-edge cool. That's the kind of innovation we need more of.
Right, Joe. It's like finding a vintage comic book, the surprise hit nobody expected, but now everyone wants. Classic case of don't judge a rag by its tatter, huh? Who knew eco could look so vogue?
Sure, Simon, eco can pull off vogue, but let's not slap on rose-tinted glasses just yet. Not everything salvaged is runway ready, and not every upcycle is a masterpiece. The true grit is in making sure these transformations really count, for style and the planet. Some designers get it. They strike that balance between form and function. But are all of them hitting the mark, or is it just another trend? If we're taking old threads and splashing them on runways as eco-couture, then cool. But is this moving the needle on sustainable fashion? Or is it just sprinkling stardust on the same old consumption game? We've got to push for more than the occasional showpiece. It's about shifting mindsets from novelty backflips to full-on forward somersaults into future-thinking fashion. Make it mainstream, not a sideshow. That's when our vintage comic finds its superpower, right?
Whoa, time flew right by. A super shout out to all of our listeners for tuning in. You're the real MVPs, making this treasure hunt a blast. Remember, don't just walk away with the loot. Come back for more banter and laughs tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. Keep those gears turning and your style eco-cool till then. Catch you on the flip side.